Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm not on the show, but I thought I would sneak in and be on the podcast intro while your father is away, Catherine. Welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. It's always so much fun.
And it's really fun to have you back in town. You've traveled back from England, and you've acclimated to our dry, cold climate. And
Oh, barely. We were in Grand Forks, North Dakota the other day, and it was just so bitterly cold.
Clay has excused himself for a moment, so I thought I'd just talk to you. Anything you'd like to talk about with this week's program?
Well,
I should first tell people that you're the host this week.
I
which
am
is
the host,
great.
back by unpopular demand as
That's
usual.
not true.
But,
That's not true.
No, it's so lovely to be here, and I think that this is a really important topic, and so it's interesting to be able to talk to.
Yeah, you obviously have a real passion about this.
I do. I confess I don't know nearly enough about it, but I'm curious, and I'd like to know more, and I'm certainly interested in the way it worked during Jefferson's time.
Yeah, and how it doesn't work during our time, it sounds
No
like
kidding.
as well.
Do you know anyone in prison?
I do not.
I don't either.
Sit down. We're doing the podcast intro. We got tired of waiting for you.
Sorry.
So
Yes.
that's
I
all
was
right.
off on important prison
You asked
reform.
me if I know anybody in prison, and I currently do not.
And you, Catherine?
I have about 25 prison pen pals.
Really?
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But I do think that would be a great thing to do.
Sometimes I think about what it would be like to be in prison. Lots of time to read.
That is true. Forced leisure, as they say.
And
But then you read about, say, the Menendez brothers or Charles Manson or someone, and they attract these. They all
They have
have
groupies.
women
They have
groupies that
groupies.
get involved with them, and
I
you
know
what?
one,
More
actually.
power to them. More power to them.
More
Everyone-
power to them. But one of the things you're working on is people who write in prison, and this is a very important genre. So Boethius wrote Consolations of Philosophy in prison. Bunyan wrote
Pilgrim's Progress.
Raleigh, of course, wrote The History of the World in prison. Malcolm X wrote his book based on his prison experience.
Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from a Birmingham
One
jail.
of the greatest letters in American history. And so this is a really interesting subject.
It is. Even people like Jeffrey Archer writing fiction while in an English prison. In
I've
the
read
20th
his
century.
trilogy. So he wrote a trilogy based on Dante's Inferno about his time in British prison. He was convicted on a corruption charge. He was a member of the British House of Lords, a distinguished popular novelist. He went to prison for 18 months, I think, and he wrote really interesting books about it.
That's true. I wonder if that will change people writing in prison now that there are so many more opportunities, not only for education, but required workforce training or required work in prison.
So Lynn Novick, who's a business partner with the great Ken Burns, and she's a good friend of mine. She largely did baseball. She largely did Vietnam. She has this new series of documentaries about prison education, college and prison. And it's remarkable to see these people that you would not necessarily expect would want to discuss King Lear or the Odyssey or Dante. But they turn out, of course, to be a cross-section of humanity, some extremely bright and intelligent prisoners, and then some who aren't. But she is documenting this sort of experimental program that has a huge ameliorative effect on prison population.
I'm glad to hear that that's there and available, because I'm sitting here trying to think of a segment of American society that we are more susceptible to having a firm stereotype in our heads to go back to. None of us have been in prison. We have no idea. It all comes from movies, and we really don't. So I'm glad to. I'm looking forward to seeing this.
And so, David, you heard me about, like in the Jefferson Watch, like those cliches about you need to have a shiv,
Yeah.
the food and the
Shawshank
fights.
Redemption, sort
Right.
of.
So that's what we know.
Well, even you, just saying. Well, I look at it like a time to read a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
It's probably a nonsense.
Yeah.
Well, just a little plug from Carnegie Hall has a program
Where you
they,
worked for a year.
Yes, but they have a program where they start orchestras in prisons, and they have music programs, and you wouldn't believe the response and how talented people are and how interested they are in creating music.
People go to prison for, of course, a wide range of reasons.
Of course.
White-collar crime. People from almost every American political administration are tried in our system. Some of them wind up going to prison. Prisons vary from hellholes all the way to a kind of almost a luxury resort view. It's a very complex system. And to think that what it would be a little more than half of 1% of all American people are in prison. That's
incredible.
That's shocking, don't you think, David?
Yeah, and I think if there was ever an instance, if we're going to talk about it in a contemporary sense, if there was ever an instance where it would be good to have an expert on the Jefferson Hour, this might be it.
And I won't go into it now, but I have done prison gigs, quite a few
Have
of
you?
them. I touched off a prison riot in California, and I got the greatest simple...
You're not joking.
And those were just the types.
No, this is true. I touched off a prison riot in a maximum security prison in Southern California.
Good
And
grief.
it was a chilling experience. And I went to a women's prison the next day, and most of these are low-level things, check kiting and drug things. It's not mayhem. And that was fascinating. And I got one of the strongest responses on race questions to Jefferson that I have ever had from a woman in that Southern California prison. So I know a little bit about this from a very, very perpendicular point of view. It's one thing to go there for an afternoon. Imagine having to spend 2 years behind bars.
Well, before we go to the show, I'm certain that both of you would join with me in wishing all of our Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners a happy holidays and a happy new year.
And by the way, February 25th, Norfolk Roper Auditorium, my comedy program. We'll talk about it more in next week's
I saw
show.
your photo, the yellow blast.
Yeah.
That's
What
great.
could go wrong?
Thank you, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the humanities scholar, author, and creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I am your guest host, Katherine Jenkinson. Good day to you, Mr. President.
Good day to you, citizen.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about incarceration. This is a subject of great interest to me and is a national crisis in the United States during my time. And I wonder what you might have to say about incarceration and the penal process in your own time.
Well, that's an excellent question. As you may know, after I wrote the Declaration of Independence, I went back to my own Commonwealth in Virginia. I believed that the future of the American Republic was really a state-by-state matter, and I always called Virginia my country. It mattered to me more than the United States, frankly, at least until I became the third president of the United States. So I went back to Virginia, and there the House of Delegates, the new legislative body of Virginia, decided to revise the entire law code, everything, all the British common law, all of the parliamentary edicts and councils, colonial legislation that had been passed by the House of Burgesses and so on. The whole body of accumulated law that applied within the Commonwealth of Virginia was now to be revised with a single eye to reason and to bring it into resonance with the principles of an American democratic republic. There were 4 members of this committee. I was just one of them, but most of the others effectively dropped out and left me with the bulk of the work. And I will tell you that it was the hardest challenge of my entire life to go through laws dating back to the Magna Carta and that wild accumulation of British common law. As you know, the British Constitution is not a written constitution, so you have to discern it from judicial decisions by the House of Lords and a wide range of other jurisdictions. And so I went through that. And one of the new laws that I proposed, some of them I simply adjusted in language to make the language more clear and kept laws that had been in operation for scores of years or hundreds of years. But in a few instances, I had to rewrite entirely. And one of the laws that I proposed was a bill for the apportionment of crimes and punishments. It was one of the most important things I ever did, frankly. And what I wanted to do was to step back and look at the legal tradition as if it were a tabula rasa, as if nothing had ever been done, and ask, well, what sorts of laws and protocols of orderly exchange of goods and what happens in the event of a conflict, and how do people settle their differences about property lines, and should there be laws affecting one's conscience, religion, and what are the crimes that a society needs to apprehend and punish. And these things turn out to be far less clear than you might think. As long as the existing tradition is in place, you effectively shrug your shoulders and accept it, however irrational it might be. But the minute you return to a state of nature, when government collapses and you start over again, then you have to ask yourself these really interesting and difficult questions about the nature of order in a civilization, and that's effectively what I did.
Well, it's interesting you should say that you were considering what should be considered a punishable crime. I wonder if it might surprise you to know that a large proportion of people in prison in the 21st century are in prison for drug crimes. How did that play out in your time, or was this even a consideration?
It was not. We didn't have any of the drugs that you might enumerate in your time. Of course, there was laudanum, which was an opium derivative. It was a tincture of alcohol with opium in it, and I took it during some of my last illnesses. And of course, Meriwether Lewis, my young friend, either became addicted to laudanum or certainly was heavily dependent upon it in his spiritual and mental struggles in the last days of his life in 1808 and 1809. And we had what you call marijuana. There was hashish, and we grew hemp, and there was some ingestation in some quarters of this.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mr. President, but can you confirm whether you were growing marijuana at Monticello?
Madam, I grew hemp, which was a naval store and used in canvas and in a range of other things, including cloth. But I was a creature of the Enlightenment, and I can say that certainly after the time I was at the College of William and Mary, I was never intoxicated in the whole course of my life, except by ideas. And the idea that I might have practiced the smoking of this substance is a ludicrous proposition.
I guess what you're saying is that you didn't inhale. But in any case, go on, Mr. President.
So these drugs didn't exist in the way that they do in your time. And of course, the stakes were so much lower with any intoxicant. So, if a man in my time, say Patrick Henry, went to a tavern in Williamsburg and drank in excess, and then he rode his horse back to his cottage, what's the worst that could happen? He could fall off his horse and break his neck, but he wouldn't cause an accident at a crossroads. He was not a particular danger to civilization unless he turned violent. In your time, of course, the stakes are dramatically and in some cases infinitely higher. And so we were more tolerant of public drunkenness in my time than you might be in yours, and the use of drugs of whatever sort, because it was such a mild-mannered world and there was so little industrial technology to get in the way or to magnify these moments. So we didn't have any particular laws about this, but of course public drunkenness could be followed by at least brief jail time, long enough for the person to sober up and dry out. But if you're saying that a significant percentage, and I would be very happy to hear what percentage that is, of people incarcerated in your time are there because of drug crimes, that would be something dramatically different from anything that was known in my era.
Well, in our time, something that's very interesting is that the number of prisoners has risen dramatically since 1976, from approximately 200,000 to over 1.2 million in 1996, and now over 2 million in 2019, relatively. But that's not because there's been a higher rate of crime, but there has been major change and restructuring of law in terms of sentencing and policy.
So the crime rate, you're saying, has not dramatically risen, but the incarceration rate has.
That is correct, Mr. President. And in fact, I can tell you that according to the Sentencing Project, which is an organization that conducts research on these sorts of things and works to change policies about incarceration in America, has shown that nearly half of federal prisoners are there because of a drug crime. And this, as you say, would not have happened in your time.
No, we had a much simpler society, and the number of intoxicants was smaller, and the stakes were lower. But let me ask you this. You step back to think about crime, as I had to do during that period between 1777 and 1781. There are really two types of crime, in my opinion. Vicious activity, murder, assault and battery, housebreaking, and so on. And then there is economic crime. And economic crime occurs when people are so poor and there are no jobs for them, there's nothing for them to do, there's no social safety net to absorb them, that they are in a sense redistributing property at the end of a pitchfork or at the end of a gun. And it would seem to me that most crime is not crime of viciousness, not crime of bad character, but crime of economic necessity. That doesn't excuse it, but it says this, that people will eat, people will shelter themselves, people will transport themselves, and if there's no way for them to do it within the existing system of economics, they're going to be desperate and take desperate measures.
Well, that's an interesting point because debtors' prisons, though no longer in practice in the United States, still do exist to a certain extent because people who don't pay their child support or fail to pay back taxes or are held in contempt of court and can't pay criminal fees are held in jails and prisons. So what does that say, that we hold people in jail because they can't pay, but thereby make it impossible for them to pay? Can you explain what the role of debtors' prisons were?
It was a species of barbarism in my time. People got themselves into debt for one reason or another and couldn't pay. There was no social procedure to renegotiate that debt except in very informal manners. So someone might finally be so deeply in debt that he couldn't pay off the collector who came, and then he would be arrested and put into a debtor's prison. They existed throughout the United States, but particularly in our cities. And in my era, when you were in a debtor's prison, you had to pay your own room and board, which is an absurdity because, of course, you're there in the first place because you have no money. And then to be there and to be expected to contribute to your food supply and to the shelter that has been imposed upon you is a sort of contradiction in terms, but that was the system. And there were important people who lost their lives in debtors' prisons in my time. The most famous example is Robert Morris. Robert Morris is known as the financier of the American Revolution, but he got in over his head after the Revolution and wound up in debtor's prison. And so here is a person. He was not a particularly admirable person. I always felt that he was engaged in peculation and skimming money that was vitally needed for the revolutionary cause. But nevertheless, he was a patriot who helped us win the war, and because he couldn't pay his bills, he speculated beyond his capacity to cover his speculations, he wound up in a debtor's prison.
That's so interesting that you say that, because today I just read about the Supreme Court Justice James Wilson, who was a signer of your Declaration of Independence, who also was in a debtor's prison in 1796 or 1797, and he remained a Supreme Court justice. That is just completely unfathomable in the 21st century.
One wonders if he was allowed to go out to sit in the juries, to sit as a justice of the Supreme Court.
We know that early modern prisons functioned very differently, and people like John Lilburn during the English Civil Wars were able to leave prison for days on end to go prepare for their cases or simply just to report back at a certain point, and that incarceration was very different than it is in modern American life. But this is all very interesting, Mr. Jefferson, and I want to ask you more about the basis for reforming the penal code in Virginia when we come back. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your guest host, Katherine Jenkinson. This week, we're speaking with President Jefferson about incarceration in the United States. Mr. Jefferson, before the break, we were speaking about your role in reforming the penal legislation of Virginia. Can you tell us more about what you were reading or thinking about, or what propelled you to take on this huge project?
I took on the project because it needed to be done, and I'm a Republican theorist. It's one thing to bring down the British colonial ministry and to declare independence from England, but that left us in what's known as a state of nature. That erases everything, and suddenly you have to recreate civilization from the ground up. You have to create a penal system. You have to create a system of the exchange of property. You have to decide under what circumstances people can write wills and have their heirs divide such property as they own. You have to determine how you're going to build postal roads and exchange the news, and what regulations you will have for corporations, if any, or what regulations you might have for the economy. You start over, and this gives you this extraordinary opportunity to really think in a fundamental way about what is a civilization and what are public functions and what are purely private matters, and so on. But none of this occurred in a vacuum. I was very fortunate in that I had great mentors at the College of William and Mary, William Small, who set the destinies of my life and put in front of me the great texts of the Enlightenment. And then he passed me on to George Wythe, the greatest Greek and legal scholar of the colony, certainly of Virginia. And I read law for 5 years with the great George Wythe. And then he, too, encouraged me to read the great texts of the Enlightenment. And in this instance, the most important of those texts was by a man named Beccaria. And Beccaria, who was born in 1738 and lived until 1794 in Milan, in what became Italy, wrote a treatise in 1764 on crime and punishment. And he did exactly what I'm suggesting. He stepped back and asked, well, under what circumstance should someone be arrested and incarcerated? And then what should that incarceration look like? And what is it that we think we're attempting to do by putting someone in a prison or a jail? Now, these are fascinating, difficult questions, but I can tell you what Beccaria's principles were. Number one, and this is the most important of them, and I certainly agree with him, that it is not in the interest of the state, the government, to seek vengeance. If you kill my brother, I may want to kill you back, the lex talionis codes of the ancient world, as expressed, say, in Aeschylus's great trilogy of plays, the Oresteia in Greece. People have a natural desire for vengeance, but the state shouldn't. The state doesn't. The state exists to restore order, but not to exact retribution. And so the punishment should, first of all, fit the crime and not be in excess of the crime, and the punishment should not be sanguinary. It should not be lustful, vengeful, angry. It should be merely a dispassionate attempt to restore order. So that principle alone would revolutionize our penal system, and it's one that I tried to incorporate. For example, and this goes to Beccaria's distaste for capital punishment. He thought that capital punishment was a species of medieval barbarism. In looking at the legal code of Virginia, found 39 capital crimes. There were 39 different things one could do in colonial Virginia to be hanged. That seemed insane to me and bloody and sanguinary. So I reduced that number to 2. I did not dare go all the way to 0, but I reduced that number to 2. Heinous aggravated murder, so not manslaughter, and treason against one's country. Those were the 2 remaining capital crimes under my bill for the apportionment of crimes and punishments. But here's the interesting thing. The Virginia House of Delegates would not accept that reform, because they wanted horse stealing to remain as a capital crime. And this is sanguinary. I mean, horse stealing is an important problem. But imagine killing somebody with state execution for the stealing of a horse.
Some might even argue it's wrong to kill anyone for any crime. Almost every country in Europe, with the exception of Belarus, has outlawed capital punishment, and the United States stands with only something like 52 other countries in the world that continue to use capital punishment. So what should we think about that? Should we hold tightly to this practice of the past, or should we move toward a different sort of penal system?
Beccaria, this Milanese reformist, this humanist from the 18th century, who was born just a few years before I was in Virginia, he believed that capital punishment was simply a mistake, that it reflected badly on the government, that it was bloodthirsty, and that it showed signs of vengefulness. And he did not think that it would deter crime. Normally the argument for capital punishment is that it's so grave and so dramatic that it deters the crimes for which it's applied. But here's another of the great principles of Beccaria. He said, the best penal system is humane, so the person is sequestered from the society and put into a prison of some sort, but should be well-fed, adequately clothed, there should be enough heat, should not be exposed to what we later called cruel and unusual punishments. And that's the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. But he said the important thing about the penal system is to make it prompt and certain, that those are greater deterrents for crime than loss of limb or torture or execution, that the best way to deter future crime is to make punishment swift and certain. And those things are more likely to be sources of deterrence than all of the whippings that you could possibly imagine.
And how did that influence United States policy, or did it simply influence you?
It influenced me, and I was able to get some of that adopted in my bill for the apportionment of crimes and punishment. So I ameliorated the condition of our penal system. I wasn't able to repair it altogether. The politics, as you know, is the art of the possible, and we must never attempt to do more than the people will bear. And in this case, even the reforms that I created, reducing the number of capital crimes from 39 to 2, was unacceptable to the Virginia House of Delegates, and they kept in execution for horse stealing. So you don't always get everything that you want, and Reformation and Enlightenment have to jerk along as best they can and wait for the moment of ripeness when the people are willing to accept more. Even so, I believe that our system of crimes and punishment in Virginia was exemplary. Beccaria was also well known to Dr. Franklin, and Franklin suggested some of the same reforms in Pennsylvania, which was in many respects the most enlightened of the colonies and states in my time. And I believe there's even a village in New England or the Middle Colonies that was named for Beccaria. I was in Milan in 1787. I had been posted to Paris as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI, and I made a journey through the south of France to examine the Canal du Midi and to go to the port of Marseille and to examine the rice productions of the south of France and northern Italy, and to try to bring the olive tree back to the United States as a useful crop. And during that time, I ventured over the Alps into Milan, and there could have met Beccaria, but did not. And I'm sorry to say that it didn't occur to me to seek him out, because that treatise, his treatise on crime and punishment from 1764, is one of the most significant products of what you call the Enlightenment. This was a time when we were reforming book production. We were separating church and state. We were trying to bring reason and good sense and science to all the aspects of life. We were creating new forms of agriculture. Steam power was being developed. We were classifying the clouds, classifying plants and animals and minerals, mapping the world, determining latitude and longitude, producing encyclopedias and digests of knowledge and almanacs. This is a breathtaking period of reason and reform. And Beccaria was central to that, and his influence on modern penal systems has been incalculably large. Probably no other person in the history of incarceration has played as significant a role as this Italian humanist.
Let's talk about theory versus practice, because as I was preparing to meet with you today, Mr. President, I looked up the rates of incarceration in Virginia in the 21st century, and I'm sorry to say that Virginia has an even higher number of prisoners per capita than the United States, which, though we have only 4% of the world's population, we account for 22% of the world's prison population, and we have more prisoners per 100,000 people than any other country in the entire world. But Virginia rises even above that. The United States average is 698 prisoners per 100,000 people, but Virginia has 779 prisoners per 100,000 people. So does that mean that your reforms failed and did not hold up, or that something has changed that has influenced this?
That's such a depressing statistic that you put forward. I blush for Virginia. I always wanted Virginia to be the most enlightened of the states, and it sounds as if that's no longer the case. The answer is public education. Public education is virtually the answer to all human problems. A well-educated, well-informed citizenry is likely to be a lawful one. People need to understand what the social compact is. They need to understand the duties of government and the responsibilities of citizenship. The idea of government under a system like ours is that we actually govern ourselves, that we're self-governing in the fullest sense of that term. And that can only be done if we're raised well by our families, possibly by our ministers and preachers, but certainly by our public schools. And one of the things that I most lamented towards the end of my life is that Virginia did not have an adequate public school system, whereas New England did. And we were already falling behind. So the first thing that I would say is that this is probably a barometric pressure of the quality of life in the state of Virginia. And if it's true that Virginia has one of the worst incarceration rates of the United States, it's an appalling condemnation of the social fabric of Virginia. Because in an ideal world, as I'm sure you can appreciate, you want no prisoners. You want no penal system. You want everyone to live and to respect the property rights and the laws of engagement with everybody else. Of course, there are always a handful of people in any population who are mentally impaired or who were subject to violent upbringings or have turned vicious, were born vicious or turned vicious for one reason or another. But if you actually could ascertain what percentage of the Virginia prison population is in some sense naturally vicious, and what percentage of the American prison population is naturally vicious, I dare say it would be a very tiny percentage. Or look at it this way. If you took off from the federal prison statistics everyone who's there on a drug-related crime that was not violent, and then if you took off from that everyone who was there for committing what I would call economic crimes, redistribution at the end of a gun out of desperation, that would leave more or less the number of hardened criminals or people that really cannot be allowed to live on the outside of a prison system. And it would be very interesting to try to figure out what those percentages were.
It would be, and I think any conversation about incarceration rates necessarily has to also acknowledge the racial disparity here. According to current statistics, Black men are almost 6 times more likely to serve a prison sentence than a white man.
To that, I can only fall into lamentation, and I have to say I bear some responsibility here because I was unable to really address the problem of slavery in any meaningful way. But when I did address it in my only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, I in some sense predicted this, I'm sorry to say. And so I said that the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions. And in effect, slavery damages both races, the masters and the slaves more than the masters, of course. It poisons our social fabric, and I knew that emancipation would come. I hope sooner, but certainly later. But once emancipation came, there was always, in my opinion, going to be racial tension in our society because former slaves would be aware that they belonged by race, by skin color, to a once enslaved class, and they would resent that and should resent it. And former masters would always fear reprisal or feel guilt or remorse for their own complicity in the world of slavery, and that this tension between freed blacks and white people who had been involved or their ancestors had been involved in the enslavement of an innocent people from Africa, that this poison would make it almost impossible to have an orderly and harmonious society. Or to put it another way, the legacy of slavery is going to last for decades and possibly for centuries, even after we have the good sense to outlaw slavery, if that makes any sense.
It does, Mr. President. And beyond that, we also have to acknowledge major systemic problems like police brutality or prosecutorial bias or forced confessions that really change the way that the penal system works and make it much less reliable and much less trustworthy.
Well, given all that you have said, let me ask you this question, madam. In your time, when you have a population of several 100 million people, is there a widespread concern about your penal system? In other words, you would hope that there would be an opportunity for reform. I was fortunate in my time, since the social compact broke down and we had to start over. This gave us a reason to look at this from a point of view of humanity and rationality and what are the best practices in the world. And that took me to the work of Beccaria. How widespread is national concern over this problem that you have raised here?
Very widespread indeed, but we've failed to see major action being taken place, although there have been some notable cases in the past several years of people being pardoned by the president or by governors for nonviolent crimes for which they were imprisoned for life or nearly for life. And so there is progress being made, but it's slow, and it's not nearly fast enough to accommodate the people that are spending their lives in prison.
Well, I really believe very strongly in the idea of the revolutionary moment. And I said in Notes on Virginia, we must make all the reforms we can now, because once the treaties of peace are signed, we'll be going downhill, and it'll be harder and harder and harder to address these sorts of fundamental questions. That's one reason, for example, why I suggested that we tear up the Constitution of the United States once every generation so that we are forced to step back and ask ourselves some of these questions. But I return to Beccaria. Our system should be swift and prompt and certain. It should be humane to the maximum degree that it can be, and there is absolutely no interest in the state seeking retribution or bloodthirsty vengeance against even hardened criminals. Anything else is not in keeping with the principles of enlightenment.
Thank you, Mr. President. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment, and when we return, we'll be speaking with the creator of the Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character now, not in wig or tights. And sitting across from me is one of my favorite people in the universe, Miss Catherine Jenkinson, my daughter. Catherine, thanks, first of all, for hosting the Jefferson Hour.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
As you know, you have a fan base who write. You do, and they insist upon.
Stop sending me hate mail.
No,
I'm
well,
kidding,
you got
kidding.
one little criticism. But mostly people are thrilled by your guest hosting occasionally, and it's always something that David Swenson looks forward to, because it gives him a little break, and he gets to see how another guest host addresses the issues of the Jefferson Hour. And you have an advantage in dealing with Mr. Jefferson that even David doesn't have. You're my daughter, and so you can. I think one of our friends that we encountered last weekend said that he loved when you're the host because you bring snark.
That was tough to hear.
You bring snark to it.
You know.
So this subject is of great importance to me, because I'll tell you my story and then you tell me yours. I have been working with a couple of individuals, including an Italian journalist named Marzio, and I'll be going to Milan sometime in the next year, 2020, to do a program, a conversation between Beccaria and Thomas Jefferson. They never met. but the conversation is a sort of what if they had met? What would they have wanted to talk about? Crime and punishment, rice production in Italy and the United States, gender issues. Beccaria had a daughter who proved to be something of a rebellious daughter, and so on. And so I'm preparing for this by reading biographies of Beccaria and studies of Jefferson on crime and punishment, and it's just utterly fascinating to me. So in addition to which, the minute you look at this, you become alarmed that we have an incarceration rate 5 times more than most of the enlightened countries in the world. And we've all read the horror stories of how DNA has proved that executions were based on misguided scientific evidence, if any, that there's, of course, a very, very large racial component in the American penal system and so on. And so for me, as a citizen, the minute you look at this, you feel horrified to think that our system is so highly imperfect. And you have a story, too.
Absolutely. But also the amount of money that we throw at this problem, upwards of $180 billion per year nationally, to a prison system that seems to be failing in many ways.
So tell me what you're doing. I know that when you were doing your master's thesis up at St. Andrews in Scotland, you were working on Sir Walter Raleigh, and now, as everyone I think knows, you're at Oxford University, Hartford College. And what's the project you're working on?
Well, I'm working on a project about the early modern prison, and specifically the Tower of London, which was only a prison in part, but it also had a function as a prison, which was very important, and it housed prisoners of state of the highest echelons. And so one thing I'm trying to ascertain is just how different is the early modern prison from the modern prison? And the answer is, very simply, very different, fundamentally different in every possible way. And we don't see the kind of so-called modern prison until the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and possibly even later. But prisons did exist, of course. They've existed
from time immemorial. The Romans had prisons, of course.
But the function of prison has sometimes just been as a holding place for someone awaiting trial, or to keep them out of politics or whatever it might be, but also a punitive aspect, and truly as a means of punishing someone and not just to hold them away from society. You're
working on a sort of a social history of the Tower of London between the time of Elizabeth and through the reign of James I.
Yes, I mean, this is all very preliminary.
And one of the things I've learned from my own study of Sir Walter Raleigh and your own is that aristocrats like Raleigh were in a certain sense, they were a club fed. They had their own cooks. They had valets and servants. They had libraries. They could come and go to a certain extent. They could have visitors and so on.
Sometimes, but not always, because there was no sort of stratified system of privileges or what was possible, what you could buy, what you couldn't buy. It
varied.
It varied, and it depended on the crimes for which you were accused and what your role was, if you were a member of the Privy Council or if you were some earl from the north. There's a wide variety, and that makes it extremely difficult to track.
You come at this as a historian rather than a social activist.
That's true, but my interest in this subject has risen partly from things I've previously studied, but also from my experience as a child following my mom, who's an attorney, to meet with people at various jails in the sort of tri-state area.
You actually go to these prisons?
I would go to the jail.
You're like a character out of a Dickens novel.
Not a prison, but a local jail.
Really?
And I would sit in the waiting room, and you just see family members so desperate to help. It's a terribly sad problem. And so my mom, I would say, is in some sense an activist for helping people who are accused of crimes, or for people accused of crimes that are marginal, to say the least. In Kansas, I don't know if this is still true, but I think it to be true. Please correct me if it's not. Your second marijuana offense is a felony in Kansas. And meanwhile, you cross into Colorado and it's a completely different ballgame. So these things seem to be very arbitrary, and they can change the course of someone's life in an instant.
The thing that I want to go back to for just a moment is Beccaria. This is 1764. This is the time of the Stamp Act crisis in the United States. And he's saying the state should not want vengeance. The state should be a humane and dispassionate facilitator of social order. And you think, of course, that can't be improved upon. But I think if we had some prison guards here, they would say, what world do you live in?
Of course. Of course. And of course, there are many sides to this story, but we know that the United States, at least 10 years ago, was routinely torturing suspects, and you can have various opinions about that.
Torturing not in the full sense of waterboarding and thumb screws.
Well, yes. I mean, I think we do know that waterboarding and thumb screws were going on.
In some instances, but not for somebody who was accused of a crime in Idaho.
No, but
for foreign nationals
and terrorists. But we also know that other things that maybe seem like they're not a part of American penal institutions do exist in this way, like border detention centers and
extraordinary renditions in other countries.
Absolutely.
Just two things from a historical note. We were once the world's epitome of humane prisons, and two distinguished visitors came here to look at that. First, Alexis de Tocqueville. He wound up writing his classic Democracy in America. He came in 1831 and 32 to study the American penal system, which was this enlightened new thing. And then Charles Dickens came twice, once in the 1840s and once in the 1860s. And his first trip was in some part motivated by his desire to see how American prisons handled problems that he was facing in novels like Oliver Twist and David Copperfield and Bleak House. And to think that we went from that, I don't think there's any dispassionate commentator in the world who would say that we have the world's best prison system today.
No, absolutely not. And just anecdotally, Charles Dickens, of course, spent time in a debtor's prison as a child. Isn't that correct?
His father was in a debtor's prison and the family moved in, which was another weird thing, that the family could move into a debtor's prison.
Just to return to what you're saying about American prisons not being the most humane, there's an extraordinary article recently in November in the New York Times by Henrik Leibel and Matthew Haag about Norwegian prisons, which have become really the ideal prison location, at least by some standards, in terms of humane treatment of prisoners.
Why does it not surprise any of us that it's Norway always?
Yes, but isn't it time, Dad, for your weekly essay?
Thank you. Thomas Jefferson wanted us to be the most enlightened nation on earth, then and forever, the most enlightened nation in human history. That meant we had to be the best educated, best informed, most peaceful, and most harmonious people on earth. We had to become the very template for rational, productive, thoughtful, and harmonious living. This is the real American dream. We were to be the secular shining city on a hill. The rest of the world would look upon us with respect, perhaps even reverence, and envy. Our example would encourage all the other peoples to adopt Enlightenment values and Enlightenment reforms. We would set the standards for the pursuit of human happiness. We would prove that humans are up to the challenge of living in dignity, order, reasonableness, and modest prosperity. Unfortunately, we have long since ceased to be the most enlightened nation on earth. We are the richest and most powerful, and in some respects we are the freest nation on earth. But we've fallen behind in some essential ways: infant mortality, literacy, freedom from poverty, social harmony, etc. I hate that. There is no reason that we should have slipped. It is a loss of will as much as anything else. When we committed ourselves to sending a human to the moon and returning him safely to the earth in the decade of the 1960s, we succeeded against what then and now seem like impossible odds. We completed the 46,876 miles of the vast interstate highway system in 3 decades. One measure of a nation's health and enlightenment is its penal system. What follows is going to be depressing if you want America to be that shining city on a hill. Our national incarceration rate is grotesquely high. As of 2017, 2.3 million Americans were behind bars. That's 5 times higher than most of the other nations of the world. Just the names alone of some of our prisons tell the story of violence, racial injustice, degradation, and despair. Sing Sing, Alcatraz, Rikers Island, Attica, Folsom. Almost 300 years ago, men like Cesare Beccaria and Thomas Jefferson sought to humanize the prison experience and create the conditions under which genuine social rehabilitation might occur. The fact that virtually everyone now shrugs or snorts at the notion of rehabilitation is a sign of how far our ideals have fallen. The logic of men like Beccaria and Jefferson went like this. For some reason, a person commits a crime. Civilization cannot permit that crime to occur without a socially agreed-upon response. The first business is to find the malefactor and take him into the custody of the state with as little violence as possible. In other words, to arrest his activities. Then she or he must receive a fair trial, with the facts of the case being evaluated by a jury of that person's social peers. If the malefactor is found guilty, we must devise an appropriate punishment. Here's where Beccaria comes in. The punishment should not constitute the civilization's revenge on the malefactor. To use the Enlightenment's term, the punishment should not be sanguinary. The society should not exult in the conviction, but feel sorrow and even sympathy. It is in the interest of the state to restore social order, thus the arrest, trial, and incarceration, but to do so dispassionately, to treat the malefactor as a full human being, and to seek to find ways to rehabilitate her or him. Conditions in prison should be clean, healthy, tidy, safe, drug and alcohol-free, and in every way humane. Social programming should be available so that the prisoner can get counseling, vocational training, education, career guidance, anger management training, and whatever else she or he needs to have a better chance of leading a safe and productive life after the prison term ends. And above all else, the prison should not be a place where an incarcerated individual's life is coarsened, brutalized, hardened, or steeped in depravity. The idea is to provide some degree of rehabilitation. If the prison turns out to be a school for further or deeper criminality, the penal system has failed utterly. The great Lynn Novick's new documentary, College Behind Bars, reminds us that authentic and useful prison education is possible. Her documentary does not try to whitewash the challenges of prison education and rehabilitation, but it tells us that we would be insane not to try to provide prisoners tools and methods by which they might become reliable and productive citizens. The great majority of American prisons abandoned their educational programs after the Clinton crime bill of 1994. This is what the Eighth Amendment might call cruel and unusual punishment. To throw prisoners into violent and unsafe prisons where first-time offenders spend their daily lives with those who have made crime their lifelong passions, and to provide no programs designed to return men and women who have done their time into socially harmonious and productive lives is cynical, irrational, counterproductive, and unimaginative. Remember, the Enlightenment ideal was to reduce, not increase the number of crimes, to eliminate righteousness, vengeance, and cruelty from the penal system, to encourage quiet penitence, and to return the criminal who has paid his or her debt to the broader social order without stigma. The idea was that the criminal was someone who had done a bad thing, but was not necessarily a bad person. I may have a distorted idea of what prison life is like, but here's what one gets from American popular culture, which is chock full of cop programs, criminal justice programs, and prison flicks. 1. You are going to be harassed, beaten, and raped. 2. You're going to have to fight for your life, so you'd better learn how to make a shiv. 3. You're going to come out of prison a hardened criminal, no matter who you were when you went in. 4. The prison guards are themselves often violent criminals who have no interest in actually helping you climb out of criminality. 5. The food is slop, and there's going to be a lot of table banging. And 6. You're going to get good at sit-ups and pull-ups. If the ideal is social security and social harmony, can we get there from here? Jefferson was no fool. He would not have believed we would ever get to the point of having no need for incarceration. Some percentage of all people are either just wired for crime or nurtured into it by very bad surrounding circumstances. But surely Jefferson would have been appalled by the staggeringly high incarceration rates in the United States, and he would have looked for ways to reform the system to reduce criminality and incarceration to their statistical minimums. He'd start by looking at nations with very low incarceration rates, say Norway, Japan, and Switzerland, and to try to see if their social conditions are similar to ours and whether their methods might be applied to American needs. Most crime is economic crime. Some people are just bad, selfish, violent, and lawless, and they would not work if they could. But most economic crime is the result of extreme poverty. People are going to get what they need to eat and find basic shelter. If the economy is configured in such a way that people who would work cannot find work and they don't qualify for public assistance that makes it possible for them to subsist, they are going to engage in criminal activity, from robbing a liquor store to joining a street gang or even to sex trafficking to find a way to eat and get shelter. It's really that simple. So if you want to eliminate economic crime, you need to begin by doing one of two things. Either you build an economy so that every willing person can work at a living wage, or you have to create a comprehensive welfare system, food stamps, free school meals, universal health care, subsidized housing, workman's compensation, free or nearly free vocational training, and direct assistance payments so that every individual and every family can have enough to live in some decency. I'd rather do the former than the latter. Unfortunately, most Americans are indifferent to this national crisis, and a very large proportion of Americans think that the have-nots are bums who just aren't trying hard enough. While this may be true for a very small percentage of social parasites, it is not true for the great majority of poor people, and only a nation that has lost its optimism and its compassion could find this state of things acceptable. I'm Clay Jenkinson, grateful that my daughter is here on winter holiday, and I'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.